Good morning to everybody and welcome to our new episode of Itanong Mo kay Serpa. In the course of conducting a research, one of the critical parts is actually to enable for the researcher to conduct or to gather the data that is relevant or that is needed in his or her research paper. However, the researcher could not just collect or gather data aimlessly. The researcher must to be guided, particularly there should be a certain tool that the researcher should use to enable for him or for her to gather data that are aligned or that are needed in his or her research paper. However, it is essential to note that the researcher could not just develop this tool, or the researcher could not just adapt from someone else's work a tool that he or she could use in gathering his or her data. We are pertaining this tool as the instrument of our research paper, wherein this instrument would serve as a tool or as the tool of the researcher to enable to have this data, needed data that are aligned to the questions posited at the beginning of our research paper. However, it is important to know that before we use that instrument, the stability or the capacity of this instrument to gather data that are needed or to gather data that are aligned to the objectives of our study should be established. And we call that usually as the validity or the reliability of our instrument. That is why in this discussion, we are going to focus mainly on answering how does validity and reliability take place in the instruments of qualitative studies. We usually encounter that word reliability and validity whenever we are dealing with quantitative research studies, in which in these quantitative designs we have this instrument wherein we first wanted to establish these two things regardless whether this instrument has been developed by the researcher himself or herself or have been adopted from other researchers. Of course, with permission from other researchers. But before we proceed further, in the course of our discussion, let us be reminded that this is not the same thing as we do in quantitative research studies. We are going to focus on qualitative studies, on instruments that are used in qualitative studies, particularly interview guides. And these interview guides would serve as the compass of the researcher in asking questions to the respondents during the data gathering procedure. Particularly, let us talk about what do we mean first when we say validity and what do we mean first when we say reliability. When we talk about validity, it tells us when an instrument measures what it is supposed to measure. It pertains to the alignment of the content of our tool, of our instrument, to enable for us to assure that what it contains is really aligned to the purpose or to the objectives of our study. That in as much as possible, we would want to remove all those questions or all those items that in no way has no relation to the objectives of our study. And how could we be able to identify the objectives of our study? The objectives lie to the SOP or to the questions posited in our SOP or the statement of the problem. That whatever is contained in our questions should, in as much as possible, be addressed or be gathered using our instrument as a tool for our questionnaire. And talking about or our instrument. So talking about validity, we are checking here whether our instrument, our questionnaire, really answers the questions posited in our SOP or the statement of the problem. On the other hand, when we say reliability, it refers to the consistency of results that an instrument may collect. We are pertaining this characteristic of the instrument that assuming that we use it over time to a same set of characteristics of our respondents, we would still be able to get the same results. It is essential for us to establish the reliability of an instrument or a tool because it would be questionable enough if assuming that we have an instrument that tells different things. There is an issue of how authentic or how truthful the results of the results of the data gathering procedure would be. That is why it is essential that we should establish first the reliability of our instrument or of our tool. However, while these are the definitions or concepts that we usually encounter whenever we are pertaining to the stability of our tools or instruments in the conduct of quantitative research, there could be a different side of a story whenever we are talking about qualitative research studies. In the course of qualitative research studies, it is actually a question of establishing really, is it validity and reliability or is it trustworthiness? Let us take a look at this one. Validity, as it determines whether the questions or the content of our tool really answers the questions in our instrument. However, there are some experts, particularly experts in statistics, telling us that is it really a question of reliability? Under qualitative research studies, it is actually difficult to measure. It is actually difficult to measure and to quantify the results of our study. That they are claiming that what is important is actually not the consistency, reliability of the results, but actually the trustworthiness of the items that would result to the answers of our respondents that could be accepted in our study. However, should it be a concept of validity and reliability, or it could be a question of trustworthiness, we are not going to deal much on that. We are going to have that on a separate discussion. So for now, since we are familiar with reliability and validity in as far as this discussion is concerned, we are going to focus consistent with the use of validity and reliability throughout the discussion proper. When it comes to when it comes to establishing the alignment of the questions or the statements in our questionnaire per qualitative research studies, it is essential that the experts will determine the alignment of objectives. These experts should be able to tell us whether the content of our instrument are really aligned to what we are trying to get or to the results that we are aiming to have in our study. So first thing first, you must be able to have these people who are experts. And how would you know if they are experts? First thing first, there should be an alignment of their specialization to the nature of your study. You cannot just have experts because they have this high position or they have acquired a higher level of education. It does not guarantee that they are already experts in that manner. It is essential that their specialization should be aligned to the nature of your study. Say, for example, you're conducting a study about a certain subject matter, and that expert, despite being a doctor, say for example, or despite being a master's degree holder, whose specialization is not aligned to the subject matter of your research paper, that person would not be considered an expert. So first thing first, you must be able to establish that the specialization of that person is aligned to the nature of your study. Not to mention that the educational qualification and experiences of that person must at least at par to your position and to your acquired educational qualifications. Upon establishing the importance of finding experts that would tell the alignment of your questions or statements in the instrument, it is essential that you must already have had these items or questions in your interview guide. So let us have this example. Assuming that we have these questions in our interview guide, read as number 1, what is your stand regarding the proposed modes of learning of DepEd in the new normal? Number 2, what do you think would be long-term outcomes of this new normal to our educational system? In an interview guide, for sure, there are more than 2 questions there, but for the purpose of simplification of our discussion, allow me to present to you just 2 questions, sample questions in our interview guide. So what are you going to do to those questions? So you have developed already your interview guide. You are going to present it to your experts, and then your experts will identify the errors, perhaps, improvement, suggestions for improvement, and most importantly, they are going to identify whether these questions are aligned to the objectives of your study. And then, basically, your instrument, you're going to revise your instrument based from their corrections or based from their suggestions. And after you have revised, you are going to have another set of people. You're going to conduct a dry run. A dry run. This is not yet your actual data gathering procedure. This is not yet your actual interview. You're going to have a dry run. Meaning to say, you're going to practice that instrument to a fewer set of people. So you ask these questions, you're going to record the responses, and then here's what you're going to do. Upon having their responses, you are going to identify or categorize their responses recommendably as follows. SP as strongly positive, P as positive, N as negative, SN as strongly negative. Given a certain question per answer, you are going to categorize whether their answers are strongly positive answers, negative answers, and strongly negative answers. Denoted by SP, P, N, and SN respectively. And then after you have categorized their responses, regardless what particular their responses are, only categorizing their responses, you are going to prepare a table. This time, what we are going to do now is to enable for us to measure whether the questions that we have developed are valid questions or not. That we are going to identify which among these questions should be removed and which among these questions should be retained. So we have here on our table, say for example, questions 1 to 4. Although in my example, I have only presented two examples, example 1 and example 2. But let us add up when it comes and as far as this table is concerned, assuming that we have 4 questions. So we have there P1, P2, P3, and P4. These are our persons. The persons involved in our dry run. Your dry run could be 3 or more persons. In your dry run, you could be able to ask 3 or more persons. But I suggest that I would suggest 3 or 5. I would suggest 4 or 5 persons. So for question number 1, we can see there that person 1, the response of person 1 in question number 1 is N, is negative. The response or the answer of person 2 in question 1 in the same question is strongly positive SP. The answer of person 3 for that same question 1 is positive P. And the answer of that P4, person 4, on the same question 1 is P positive. And then you'll do the same procedure from person 1 to person 4, from question 1 to question 4, or until such time that you finish all the questions in your interview guide. So you'll have there coded table. And then you're going to expand your table. You are going to match those persons by 2. You're going to have pairings. In this example, we have since there are 4 persons, we were able to have 6 different combinations or 6 different pairings. Is this essential that you would pair our persons? The more persons that you include in your dry run, the more pairings that you have. For 5 persons, there would be more pairings there. For our first pair, we have paired the responses of person 1 and person 2. For the second pair, we have compared person 1 and person 3. For the third pair, person 1 and person 4, and so on and so forth until such time that we hit the last pair where we paired the responses of person 3 and person 4. After pairing them, let us identify how many of them have had a consistent or the same response. Looking into the response of person 1 and person 2 for question number 1, the response of P1 is N, is negative. The response of P2 is SP, strongly positive. They are not the same. Their responses are not the same. So we'll denote that as 0. Every time that we'll have a response that is not the same or which category is not the same, we'll write it 0. On the other hand, if the categories are the same, we'll write 1. If they are not 0, not the same category, 0. The same category, 1. Let us have our question number 1. As we pair P1 and P2, N and SP, they are not the same, 0. For the second pair, P1 and P3, N and P, they are not the same, 0. For P1 and P4, they are not the same, N and P, 0. P2 and P3, SP and then P, they are not the same, so 0. For the fourth pair, P2 and P4, SP and P, they are not the same, 0. But for the last pair, sixth pair, where we have paired the response of P3 and P4 for question 1, their answers are both categorized P, positive. So we denote that as 1. And you'll do the same process from question number 1 until such time that you reach question number 4. And that's the completion of the extension of our table. We extend it further. We'll have the sum, the column for the sum, wherein you get the summation of all the pairings. So for the question number 1, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0 plus 1, you'll have 1. For the second question, 0, 0, 0 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1, you'll get 3, and so on and so forth. So you'll have the column for the summations. To it are 1, 3, 3, and 0. And then you're going to compute for the ratio, wherein the denominator would be the number of persons involved, in your table. So since there are 4 persons involved in your table, that would be divided by 4. 1 divided by 4 is 0.25. 3 divided by 4 is 0.75. And 0 divided by 4 equals 0. How are we going to determine the validity of these questions? If it is 0.25, not valid. 0.75, valid. 0.75, valid. 0.00, not valid. How would you be able to identify if it is a valid question or not? It is recommendably that if a ratio of 0.30 or higher makes a question valid. The values should be 0.30 or a perfect 1.0. That makes your question valid. Otherwise, it's not valid if it is 0.29 or less. So in this kind of example, out of 4 questions, we were only able to have 2 valid questions. And what you're going to do to these items that hit not valid category? Well, it depends to your jurisdiction, but there are only 2 options. It's either you remove them or you revise them. In as much as possible, when it is said there not valid, you better remove that question. But should there be any chance that there are so many questions that have been removed, yet you think are essential in your study, you would better just revise that question. Moving forward, as we have already determined the items that should be removed based whether they are valid items or not, the next thing that we have to do is to establish the reliability of our instrument. In this computation, we're going to compute for the reliability of the final version of our instrument as a whole. We're not pertaining to its reliability by item. We are measuring the reliability of the new version of our instrument as a whole in itself. However, we are not 100% actually talking about reliability here, but it would be better if we could be able to measure that reliability based on the agreement of our persons during our dry run, the agreement when it comes to their responses. How much do they agree with their responses? In that kind of endeavor, we are going to utilize the Flay's kappa, wherein this Flay's kappa is appropriate whenever we measure the agreements of 3 or more persons in a particular reliability computation of a certain instrument. It is essential that it would include 3 or more persons. In that case, the use of the Flay's kappa is appropriate. And in this kind of example, I am recommending the use of the Flay's kappa. And here's how we are going to, what we are going to do whenever we deal with the Flay's kappa. So first thing first, we are not deal much on how essentially it should be done statistically. You only have to prepare that file and let your statistician do the work for you. But what you're going to do for your column A, you write there your items, how many questions or items do you have in the final version. We're talking about the final version of your instrument. In this case, there are 12, and then there are 4 columns there. Those 4 columns signify the 4 categories. SP, strongly positive, P, positive, N, negative, SN, strongly negative. For valid question number 1, we're talking about valid questions. For valid question number 1, how many among those persons have had an answer that is categorized SP? In that kind of example, there's only 1. For P, they are 2. For N, there is only 1. For SN, none of them have had an answer that is SN. So, in a nutshell, while we have reached this far already with our discussion, how would you know if it is SP, strongly positive? How would you know if it is P, positive? How would you know if it is N, negative? How would you know if it is SN, strongly negative? Well, to enable for you to be guided in categorizing your the responses of your respondents, you better construct a rubric wherein in that rubric you would have these standards when a certain response will be categorized SP, when standard, when it could be considered P, and SN. So you're going to complete that for valid question number 2. For SP, none among your respondents have had an SP. So 3 among them, 3 had a response of P, only 1 for N, and none of them have had a response that is categorized as A. And you're going to complete that process from question number 1 up to the last valid question in your interview guide. In this case, there are 12. 12. And then, your statistician is going to conduct a computation. And among those many numbers, you're only going to look at that green value, the kappa. The kappa, that is the Flay's kappa. In this case, the kappa, the value of the Flay's kappa is 0.73. 0.73. And how would you know if your interview guide is valid or not? It is recommended that your Flay's kappa should be 0.60 or higher. 0.60 or higher. This makes your instrument reliable. This makes your instrument reliable. So since the computed kappa, Flay's kappa in our given example is 0.73, which essentially is greater than 0.60, congratulations, your interview guide is valid and at the same time reliable. That's the time that you could further and you could proceed to your data gathering procedure. And that ends with our question. If you like this video, please don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel. Bye-bye!